for physical perfection. That's not what this is about. This is a strong desire that your spouse communicates self-respect for themselves and consideration for you by the way they take care of themselves. Are they just letting themselves go and being a slob, or are they taking care of themselves? For some people, this is a need for them to have a spouse who communicates self-respect and who shows consideration for the other by the way that they take care of themselves in regard to choice of clothing, hairstyle, makeup, personal hygiene, weight. Yeah, you may not like it, but for some people that is an emotional need. Next on the list, financial support. That's another one of those things that people sometimes discount. Well, that's just shallow. Well, that's just about greed. That's just materialistic. But listen, people sometimes marry for the financial security that they think that spouse is going to provide for them. And if they don't have that financial security, then it can be a source of tremendous anxiety for them. You see, this need is not about greed. It's about feeling secure and stable. And if they don't have a certain amount of financial support, they feel insecure and unstable. And they have a hard time being content. So financial support. Next on the list is domestic support. What do you think this would include? This is chores, isn't it? This involves the creation of a peaceful and well-managed home. It includes things like cooking meals, washing dishes, doing laundry, cleaning house, childcare. If you feel very fulfilled when your spouse does these things, or if you feel very annoyed when they don't do these things, then you probably have a need for domestic support. Do you remember in last week's sermon how I told you about that lady that I'd heard one time? She said that the sexiest thing her husband does is when he washes the dishes. Well, she is someone who has a need for domestic support. That's one of her top emotional needs, obviously. And then you have family commitment. And sometimes people get those confused. Domestic support, family commitment, they're not quite the same. This is different from domestic support in that family commitment is about spending quality and quantity time with your children and being involved in family activities. In other words, domestic support involves changing diapers. Family commitment involves the priority you place on your relationship with your children. You're there for them. You're investing in that relationship. And then the last one that he lists is admiration. Now, this need reflects a deep desire to be respected, valued, and appreciated by your spouse. It's the need to be affirmed clearly and often. If a compliment can make your day, or if an insult or a criticism can ruin your day, then it's possible that you may have a need for admiration. You'll notice on that list that I also listed some blank spaces. And Harley admits, this is not an exhaustive list. Harley says that there could be thousands of different emotional needs. These are just the ones that in 30 years of practice he's found to be the most common. Maybe you have something you would add to that list. I have a need for, peanut M&Ms or whatever. I don't know. Well, I won't share names, but I know some people who claim they have an emotional need for chocolate. Could be. Dr. Harley writes that in order to have a healthy marriage, you have to do a really good job of meeting your spouse's top 5 emotional needs. Maybe you looked at that list, you thought, I can't cover all that. I'm exhausted just after reading this. Well, he says you don't have to meet every single need on that list. You just need to find out what your spouse's top 5 needs are and meet those. Harley also says that meeting the top 3 needs, whatever those needs are, is absolutely essential. Those are non-negotiables. Those are must-haves. You must meet those needs, or your spouse will never feel content and loved. So you've got to meet the top 3. He says, but all top 5 must receive attention. Now, as you look at the list of those needs, do you know what your top 5 emotional needs are? You see, you can't expect your spouse to meet your needs if you don't even know what those needs are yourself. And a lot of people don't. They really don't. They know how they feel, but they've never really identified what's causing them to feel loved or unloved. So how do you determine your top 5 needs? Well, another quote from Harley I think helps in this regard. He writes, "The most important emotional needs are those that give you the most pleasure when met and frustrate you the most when unmet." Those are your top needs. As you look down that list of emotional needs, think of it this way. If your spouse met every single one of these needs for you, which one would make you feel most loved? That's probably your top need. Or you could look at it this way. If your spouse didn't meet any of these needs for you, oh, I hope none of you are in that situation. If they didn't meet any of these needs for you, which one would frustrate you the most? Harley gives us another quote I think that's helpful. He says, "Fantasies in general are good indicators of emotional needs. Your most common fantasies usually reflecting your most important needs. Are you prone to start daydreaming thinking, oh, if only he or she would just do this? Why is that so difficult? Why can't they just do that? That would be wonderful." If you're having daydreams like that, that may signify an unmet emotional need that is very, very important to you, very high on your list. When I work with couples in this regard, we're trying to identify their top emotional needs. Here's how I will approach it sometimes. I'll say, okay, let's imagine that for the rest of your life, as you live out the rest of your life with your spouse, let's imagine that they were only going to meet one need off this list for the rest of your life. Now, that would be a miserable situation to be in, wouldn't it? Totally unfair. That's just terrible. But let's imagine that was the situation. But you got to choose which need that would be, which need they would meet. And so, if you could only have one thing for the rest of your life, what would it have to be? And so you write that down. You check it. You'll notice I put these little hash marks so that later, not right now, but later you can rank your top 5 emotional needs. So you say, okay, they'll meet that need, and if that's the only thing I can have, I'll take that one. That's my number 1 need. Then after that you ask, okay, well, if you can have that need, and then only one more off this list and nothing else for the rest of your life, well, what would you next choose? And so you write that down, and that'll be your second need. And then you just go on down the list. You keep asking that question. Okay, if I could have number 1 and number 2, and then just one more, what would it be? Well, that'll be number 3. You just go down the line, and you determine your top 5 needs. Is that as clear as mud? I'm trying. Now, after you determine your top 5 needs, and your spouse does the same, and maybe you're thinking, my spouse is not going to do this. Maybe they won't. But you do it. You go ahead and do it. You need to understand. You need to know yourself before you can communicate to your spouse what you need. And you need to communicate to them. Whether or not they communicate to you, you communicate to them what you need. So you go ahead and do it. But ideally, if both spouses will do this, then sit down with each other and talk about it. And be very careful to notice the differences in your lists. Pay attention to that. Very rarely I have couples, and this is like maybe 2 couples out of the past 10 years, out of 40-some couples, I'll have lists that actually match. That's incredibly rare. Most of the time, the lists are very different. Pay attention to those differences. Here's why. I'll tell a story to illustrate this. There was an elderly couple who had been married for 50 years. They had their 50th wedding anniversary. Friends and family over, had a big party, lots of fun. Well, after the party was over and everyone else had gone home, later that day, one of them turns to the other and says, you know what? I'm kind of hungry. I think I'd like a sandwich. The other one said, that sounds good. Me too. So they both go into the kitchen. They go into the kitchen, and she reaches for the refrigerator, opens the door, and she starts pulling out the fixings for the sandwich. At the same time, he reaches over to the loaf of bread. And as he's pulling out bread, he pulls out 2 pieces of bread for himself. And then on her plate, he puts a piece of bread, a regular piece of bread, and the heel of the loaf. Yeah, he's asking for trouble, isn't he? He puts the heel of the loaf. You know what the heel of the loaf is, right? It's that piece of bread that's half covered with crust that's on the end, the heel of the loaf. So he gives her a regular piece of bread and the heel of the loaf. Now, she sees this. She slams the refrigerator door and she turns around and she says, that's it. For 50 years, I've kept my mouth shut. But after 50 years, I've earned the right to tell you what I really think. For 50 years, you've been giving me the heel of the loaf, and I want you to know I don't appreciate it. I don't like it. I'm tired of this disrespect. I'm not going to put up with it anymore. There, I finally said it. Now, he's standing over here. His eyes wide, stunned. His mouth dropped open in disbelief. And then, in a quiet voice, he says this, "But it's my favorite piece." Oh.